optimize and improve that performance. And the critical part here is the idea of continuous improvement. We are not just here to look at pretty pie charts for the sake of fancy reports. We want to do something about it. Digital analytics is also a process. We first perform the measurement, we apply analysis, and we learn from what we see, and then we take action. Our site is constantly changing, our marketing is changing, and the digital tools themselves are changing. We need to make sure our analysis process doesn't become stale, but rather evolves and keeps up with those changes in order to ensure our site is always performing at its best. Now, before we jump right into the Google Analytics tool, it's important that we first go over some key definitions to know within the digital analytics sphere. Understanding these concepts will really give you a head start in knowing how to manipulate and interpret the data available to you not only in Google Analytics, but really any analytics tool. The first two concepts you're going to be hearing about a lot in this course are metrics and dimensions. They even have their own video where we walk through examples, but I want to introduce them here as a baseline. These two variables make up all of the data populated in the analytics reports. And metrics are the quantitative numbers that are measuring data in counts, ratios, percentages, and the like. Dimensions are the qualitative categories that describe the data in segments or breakouts. Now, when we think about digital analytics, it's pretty obvious we're talking about the relationship between us, the online business entity, and the consumer who's visiting our site, mobile application, or whatever other digital experience we provide. When it comes to the basic concepts of a digital experience, the first step is getting those real-life individuals onto our site and generating page views. A page view is quite literally a view on a page within our site. The number of page views acts as a count for every time a visitor loads that page. Once a user is viewing a page, they're free to interact with whatever content's on there that they please. We call these distinct actions hits. There are different types of hits we can measure in analytics. One is a page view. This is a page tracking hit as a visitor is interacting with a page simply by loading it. Another is an event tracking hit, which is made up of any general on-site activity you choose, such as clicking a button or even scrolling down on a page. There are also e-commerce tracking hits that are specific for e-commerce events like product clicks or adding to a cart or checking out. A group of hits within a given time frame make up a session. In Google Analytics, a session is whatever interactions that are taking place between when the visitor enters your site and when they exit. We used to call this a site visit. Now, an exit can either be where you hit the X on the browser and you leave the site, or if the user doesn't interact with the site for 30 minutes, it will expire. So after 30 minutes of non-interaction, the session times out, and that's the end of the session. However, if a user leaves your site but then returns within 30 minutes, they're still counted as part of that original session. Next, we have the user, and these are the people visiting your site. In Google Analytics, a user is specifically identified by a client ID. These are stored in browser cookies. Analytics is able to see multiple sessions from the same user. If they return to your site on that same browser, that same device, those will be multiple sessions and, of course, multiple hits, but all back to that same user. A group of users who share a similar dimension or fall under the same category can make up a segment. Segments can be divided by things like physical location, the type of device that's being used, the traffic source the user is coming from. Basically, any way that we can differentiate those users, we can create a segment for that. Now, this is also a really important concept to understand, so we're going to discuss this in a dedicated video later in the chapter. Now, I mentioned how analytics is all about measuring your business objectives. When a user completes an action you wanted them to take, we call that a conversion. This conversion data is sent over to Google, and you can look at those more closely to understand how the user is behaving and if they're behaving the way you want them to. Defining your goals and what it means to convert is unique to each business. A goal can be when a user completes one or a set of events, which we defined earlier as anything on the site or on a page like a button click. Now, if a user completes a purchase on your e-commerce website, that specific event of completing the order, we can set that as a goal, and we can track that in Google Analytics. Now, where a user comes from is also important when you're considering your digital performance. We want to know who's sending us our traffic, and the source is where the user traffic originated from, and the medium is the avenue that traffic took to get from the source to your site. For example, let's say a user was scrolling through Twitter and clicked on a post that linked to your site. The source of the traffic would be Twitter, that's the who, and the medium they took was the social, that's the how. These sources and mediums are really relevant when we're thinking about how we acquire our visitors. We'll discuss this later on. And lastly, when a user enters your site and they do end up converting, you probably want to know where they came from and what they did on the site to cause that conversion. Analytics defines this process as attribution, and it's all about assigning value to those touch points it took to get up to the conversion. With attribution, we can analyze which traffic sources deliver users that are more likely to reach our goals and which parts of your sites can help in that goal completion. This is a really important topic to consider, and although we won't be going into super detail in this course, attribution is definitely a real buzzword in the analytics world and something we want to know about. All right, we went over these terms a bit quickly, but don't worry, it won't be the last time you'll be hearing about things like metrics and dimensions and segments. Even if you couldn't quite get the concept of, say, tracking events here, we're going to go over those in detail in a video, and I just want you to have the basic concept here so it's not a new term for you. And without further ado, let's jump in and start learning. Now that we've discussed the value of Google Analytics to your business and some key concepts that go along with using the service, we can finally start to dive into the tool itself. In order to understand how to install Google Analytics and to interpret what our reports are showing us, it's important to first talk at a very high level about how Google Analytics actually works. Now, in order to retrieve data from users who visit your site, there are two pieces of information that are required. First, users who visit your site must allow Google Analytics to set the first-party cookies that identify the individual users who visit your website. These cookies will gather data on your users as they travel through your site, such as IP address, what type of device they're using, which page they're viewing, and more. Now, if folks have blocked cookies through their browser, then Google Analytics can't track them and it won't work for that particular user. Second, you need to copy the JavaScript tracking code, also known as a global site tag, to your site so that it runs in the user's browser. Once you create an analytics account, you'll be given this unique tracking code that looks something like this. Don't worry about the details of the code for now. Just know this code needs to be implemented on every single page of your site with no exceptions. We'll go over this a little bit more later, but this JavaScript tracking code is essential for data from that web page to transfer back to Google Analytics servers for processing. So speaking of that, how does a segment of data travel from a user's cookie to the report on Google Analytics? Well, let's say that a user is visiting your website for the first time. Now remember, your site must have the JavaScript tag embedded in the HTML of all of your pages in order to track this user. So when your user enters the site in the browser, they access your web server, this is going to return the HTML that your browser will use to show that website to the user. Buried inside of this HTML, the web page will have that embedded JavaScript tracking code which creates and manages the cookies and collects that anonymous information about the user from the browser. As the user continues their journey across your site, that little tracking tag continues to collect data on the actions that they take, and this sends this information over to Google Analytics servers. It's here in these powerful data centers where Google processes all of this raw data about your user. Now, depending how much traffic volume you have and the type of Google Analytics account, there can be a wide variance in how long it takes from the time a user sees the web page until the data from that session shows up in our reports. The exact details of this can be a little bit complicated, but for our purposes, you can use these guidelines. If you have Google Analytics 360, which is the paid version of Analytics, you are guaranteed your site will be processed in less than 4 hours, although it's actually usually much, much faster. Most of you are going to have a standard free version of Google Analytics, and in that case, if you have less than 200,000 sessions per day, you'll likely see those sessions processed within about 3 or 4 hours. Accounts beyond the 200,000 sessions, sometimes known as visits, per day, will likely skip this intraday processing and only process in that one big batch overnight. In fact, some really large accounts on the free version may see delays of up to 48 hours or more until all that data comes in. And it's worth noting that if you have more than 10 million hits per month, Google may force you onto the paid 360 version entirely. Now, once Google's finished processing this information within that 4 to 24 hour time frame, the organized data is going to be delivered to the user-friendly interface available to you within the Google Analytics platform. Here you'll be able to view the numerous reports on the behavior of users, which we're going to dive into in the rest of this course. Now, it's impressive to see how many insights you're able to glean about your users from such a simple process here. Again, this basic overview is kind of a behind the scenes on how it acquires and reports on the data. If you'd like to see a closer look at this process, do a quick Google search for Google Analytics Developer Guide, which explains the tracking and JavaScript tags in glorious detail. But for now, let's get started putting this to use. Now, if you haven't already, the first thing to do is set up your Google Analytics account. So head on over here in your browser to analytics.google.com. And if you're not signed into your Google account yet, go ahead and log in. Remember, this doesn't have to be a Gmail, and in fact, for work accounts, we sometimes recommend that it's not, but any Google account will work. And we'll get this splash page for a brand new Google Analytics account. We can go up here and look at the overall Google marketing platform, of which is all the different products that you can sign into with this account. Tag Manager down here, for example, we have another course on. What we're interested in today here is analytics, so we're going to go ahead and click Set Up for Free. And this is going to be our analytics account, and so we're going to name that. We can give this a somewhat generic high-level name. I'm going to call this my GA demo account. And below here, we have some sharing settings. So this is for about the data that you want to share with Google. You can have a read through here and decide what you'd like to share. For the most part, I would just recommend folks keep the default, but it's up to you. And the next thing it's going to ask us about is what we're trying to measure in this particular property here. The options here are website or mobile apps, iOS and Android. There's also a beta down here for combined apps and web. Now, this is actually a completely new product. It's still in beta and it's outside the scope of this course, but we'll have a whole series of videos on this when it launches fully. For our course here, we're going to be focused on the web, so we'll select that and click Next. Next, it's going to ask us about our website that we're tracking here. So I'm just going to put in a website name as my name. You can call it whatever you want, but I tend to put in the website name for both that and, of course, the URL down here. Helps me keep track of those. Select industry category and the time zone that you want the reporting to be in, and click Create. Here it'll present us with some terms of service and some different options here around data privacy. Again, you can read through those. Not a lot you can do to negotiate that. So if you want to use the product, you pretty much just have to accept it. Next, we're going to let Google know where we want to hear from them in terms of email. So we can check or uncheck those and save that. We're going to get some marketing alerts here to things like the mobile app and some different pop-ups that'll show us around the interface, but we're going to dive into all of that bit by bit. The main thing here we're going to see is the tracking ID. We're going to dive into this in depth in a few videos here and tell you exactly what to do with this. But for now, if you've made it to this screen, just know that you have successfully created a Google Analytics account and you are ready to start implementing your tracking code. In the last video, we created a Google Analytics account under our main Google account, and we stopped at this part here. We were presented with this tracking code. Now we're at the point where we can finally take that last step before we can see the actual reports of our website analytics, and this step is to install this JavaScript code on the site that you're going to track. Now, I need to pause for a minute and say this is not an in-depth course on how to install Google Analytics, which can require some web development background. This course is mostly about how to use Google Analytics. In order to get you going, I'm going to show you the process for how you might install this code, a little bit how it works, but you should be warned that every website is different, and if you aren't familiar with how the code on your site works, you should stop right now and get the help of your site admin or developer. So for the sake of example, I'm going to show you a simple site, but again, it doesn't mean that your site is going to be coded in this exact same way. So if you're here and if you want to come back here, it's simple enough. If we're somewhere else, say back at the home screen, we would come back to the admin section down here. Come on over, select your account, select your property, and then come down here to tracking info and click on tracking code. And that's how you get back to this spot. We're going to simply copy this data here. It's got some more information here too. We've got our tracking ID, this UA number that often we're going to be asked for. And then of course, you'll notice this actually uses a Google Tag Manager on the background. We're going to paste this one in directly, but I want to have a quick plug for the Google Tag Manager course. If you have a lot of these scripts to track on your site, if you're going to be using a lot of tags, then I highly recommend you check that out. There is a Linda course here I've done on Google Tag Manager, and it can really make your life a lot simpler when trying to manage all these different tags. But for the sake of this course, we're just going to grab this code here and copy that into there, and we're going to paste it into our site. Okay, so I'm going to show you our example site here. In fact, I'm going to use the site from the GTM course. And if we go and we look at the underlying code on here, we go to View Page Source, what we're going to see is, as they told us, go back to the analytics for a sec, it says we want to paste this as the first item into the head of every web page that we want to track. Okay, so we're going to go, and I've done just that. If we look into the header tag here, and what you'll see is exactly that script here. You'll recognize that UA number. It's been pasted as the first item here into the head tag. And we see that on the website. So again, you want to do that for every single page. And then when this page loads, it's going to load our script here. It's got our account number, and it's going to send that data back to Google, where it's going to be captured into our account and added to our reports. Now again, how you get this pasted into the head on here, whether it's an include file, whether you go through something like WordPress.com or Wix or something that'll have built-in ways to do this, where they'll just ask you to take the UA number and paste that directly in, and it will take care of the rest of that. That's going to be up to your site, and you should consult your developer. But one way or another, we need to get this code on the page. Okay, so now we've got our tracking code on here. We go back to our page here, we can check our status and see if there's traffic received here. And we see there is one active user on here right now. Of course, that's me. You can send test traffic if you like. So as far as installing goes, this is about it. Now we sit back and we wait for the data to come in for users to visit our website and for the data to come into our reports so we can analyze our users. While we wait for that, I've got a couple more things we're going to do in the next chapter, kind of back up and talk about the ecosystem and maybe pull in some demo data so we can get right away into analyzing. While we wait for the data to start populating your account, it's worth taking a moment to talk about how we manage our account and keep it secure. Overall, Google's goal has been to make Google Analytics both easy to use, but still incredibly powerful, which can be a difficult balancing act. Before we dive into the reports and the analysis tools available, let's discuss a few things about the ecosystem of Google Analytics itself. The first thing to talk about is how the levels of Google Analytics are nested. At the top of the hierarchy is the Google Analytics account. This is your login, your password to all the Google services, Gmail, Hangouts, Analytics, AdWords, and so on. As we've touched on before, you create your Google Analytics account with your overall Google user login, and the difference between those two can be a little bit confusing, but it is important to know that your account for Google Analytics is different than your Google account. Now, while you start with one Google Analytics account when you first begin using Google Analytics, you can actually create numerous accounts all nested under that one Google account according to your business needs. This account level usually serves as the entity for an entire business's analytics reporting. So as long as you just have one singular business you'll want to report on, we suggest you just stick to that one account for the business. But you may consider having access to several accounts if, for example, your position requires analyzing multiple clients' websites, or like you see on this slide, maybe you have one for your personal website and maybe one for your company, and they're both tied back to your one account. Or if your company has multiple brands and you have multiple different sites that are completely unique entities, you could have different accounts for those as well. Now, within an account is at least one property. We generally recommend a business to have a property for each website or platform. And by platform, I mean, for example, if you have both a website and an application for your business, like a mobile application, you may have two properties and that will report on each individual platform. So one for web, one for the mobile apps. Now, within each of those properties are something called views. Views are really powerful, and advanced users are going to find all kinds of ways to tweak them, but they can be a little bit confusing at first, and we're not going to dive really deep into them in this course, other than just to explain what they are. Think of each view like a lens into that database that can be configured completely independently of the others. For example, in one view, you may want to have data from just California, or maybe you have multiple country domains that feed into this one account, but you can create these views that are going to separate out just your French site, for example. In some ways, it's like you have a duplicate data set that tracks that same site and it's all coming from that one tracking code you put on, but they can be configured completely differently. And that goes for both the data and for the permissions that you're going to give users. We'll see that in just a minute. Now, you can create up to 50 of these views. Every web property should have at least 3 views. If you're going to experiment and go down that route, everyone should create at least these 3. So first, it's often useful to have a main reporting view where you can do the majority of your analysis. This can be the current one that it creates for you. Second, you should have a test view where you can make some mistakes. You can try new filters. You can generally mess with things and see what happens with no fear of hurting your actual data. So create that view that's just for testing. Lastly, you're going to have a raw, unfiltered view that's just the pristine data. No filters on it whatsoever. It captures all the data, and that way you can make sure at least then you have all the data if you ever need to go back and take a look at it. Because remember, the data that comes through this view, if you filter it, it's going to be processed through that filter way before it even reaches your reporting interface. And what that means is you can't go back and revert the data back to its raw form once you've filtered it. Because of that, it's really this best practice to have this unfiltered view that acts as a bit of insurance policy against any mistakes you might make in your main reporting or, particularly your testing one. You can always go back and check that raw, unfettered data. Now, let's move into the tool and take a quick look at how we move across these accounts, properties, and views. If we go up here and click on here, we have our accounts, we have our properties, and we have our views across here. Now, on the top, we can star a view. We can go up here and click, and it'll show us our starred views. Now, of course, we only have one here, as well as our recent. So it's a way we can organize if you start getting lots of these inside of here. If you want to create new properties and views, we'll look at the admin section a bit later, but you can come over here and create property, create view. So we talked about creating those 3 views. You could do so right here. And lastly, we want to talk about the search navigation here. If you get quite a few of these in here, you can search through them and filter that way as well. So we're going to come back to the admin tab here, but I want to give you a quick sense of how these properties, views, and accounts all work together. We'll look at the admin tab in a minute. But what we're going to do now is we're going to turn our attention to the data that's inside your account. In the last 2 videos, we've shown you how to begin collecting data for your own site. Because that's brand new, it can take some time for that data to stream in and populate your reports. But we don't want to wait to dive into our analysis, so we're going to borrow some demo data from Google that will help us walk through the features of Google Analytics. Now, for this demo data and many of the examples in this Essentials course, the site we're going to be pulling from and analyzing data for is Google's own demo account, which is connected to their merchandise store. It's where they sell t-shirts and other Google things, and Google's allowed us to use the Google Analytics data for that free, publicly available analytics property so we can see the real-time, some accurate data, and it also comes from the e-commerce website, which not all of you may have set up, but allows us to see some actual transactions flowing through. So we're going to be focusing on the reports within this demo account for this course. To gain access to this account for yourself, you can simply go to google.com and do a search for Google Analytics Demo Account. Click on the first one that comes in here, and it will show you how you can access the demo account. Come down here, click on the link, Access Demo Account. So this is going to put us right here into here. You can see it's already pre-populated, still here in my own account, but I'm viewing the Google Analytics demo account. So we can come here and take a look here. Again, we see we had our one we set up before, and now we see another account's been added to our overall Google account. In this one, we have this property here, the Google Merchandise Store, and we have 3 views already set up. And look at that, Google following exactly what we talked about before, a master view, a test view, and a raw data view, following best practices, just like we talked about. Okay, so we've got this demo account. This is what we're going to be using from here on out to take a look around the interface and get a taste of the various reports that Google Analytics can provide. Let's go over some basics on navigating around the Google Analytics platform. When you log into Google Analytics, you're going to be greeted with this home screen. As we went over before, you can come up here in this drop down and you can select the account, property, and view that you wish to analyze here. Now you can also come up here, select your favorites. That's going to be whether or not you've toggled on or off this star, or just some of the recent views if you tend to access the same ones. Or lastly, you can simply search here if you know the name of the view you'd like to see. Another option, though, it's a little bit hidden, is to come up here and click this icon here in the top left, and that's going to show you all in one screen this account, property, and views. And it's the same info we just saw before, but in a slightly different way. And just for me personally, I tend to like this one better. It just makes sense to me that there's this hierarchical nesting of folders. But whatever works for you, you can pick the view that you want to access. Now, we navigate the interface here using the tabs on this left-hand panel. This panel can open and close with this arrow down here at the bottom if you need a little bit more space for your dashboard or if you want to drill down in and expand those out. Now, if we do have this closed, I want to point out that if you hover over these, it will give you the names, and then when you click on them, it'll expand that out for you. So let's go ahead and keep that expanded and kind of come up here to the top. We see another search bar, and this one is specifically for reports and content that you're going to view in this main dashboard. So once again, this is helpful if you know the exact report you'd like to analyze and you want to save yourself the trouble of toggling and drilling down into those reports and subreports. So for example, if I want to view data on traffic coming in from different channels, I can just come in here and type channels. It's going to show me the reports that match that word, and I can click directly into those. It will actually open the panels over here directly to that report and highlight that. Coming down here from the search bar is the Home tab. Now this is going to be a general dashboard. Google's created this for you. It's going to feature a digest of some of the most important things going on in your site. It's going to display some important metrics like users and revenue and a real-time report widget and some more insights regarding your users and the overall performance of your site. On the right side of this Home tab, you can come up here and click this little Insights panel. This is going to have an intelligence report. It's going to share some interesting insights about how your site's performing, and it can be useful to scroll through here and see what interesting tidbits Google's algorithms have unearthed about your site performance. For example, we see here it's found a site speed issue that a top page is actually loading slower now, and give you a bit more information about that. Coming back to the main dashboard here and scrolling down, we're going to see some pre-created dashboards designed to address some of the most common questions that marketers might have. And I think this is actually a really good place to start. If you look through here, so how do you acquire your users? How are your active users trending over time? How well do you retain your users? When they come, when do they actually visit? And where are they coming from? What are the top devices they're using, and so on? If you're brand new to digital analytics, I suggest you pause here and have a closer study of each one of these to really familiarize yourself with the type of data that Google Analytics can offer. Okay, moving on in our tour of the navigation, come back here. The next one down here is customization. Now, because deeper customizations of platform aren't truly essential, we're not going to go over these in depth. However, I want to point this out as an area for you to come back to and explore once you get your foundation established, as it's a pretty handy feature once you become that power user. Okay, let's head down here to the actual reports section where all the built-in reports for this particular review reside. Here we should be able to access the real-time, audience, behavior, and conversion reports. In this course, we're going to spend a lot of time here. We're going to cover all the widely used reports in this entire section and how you can leverage them and really find insights from those to improve and customize your site. Down here towards the bottom, we're going to see a beta for attribution and, importantly, the admin tab. Now, we've briefly gone through the admin tab in previous videos, so we know it's here and we can adjust all of the settings for the account's properties and views. One thing to note is you don't always have access to all of these settings. In a later chapter, we're going to go over how to manage the user permissions here on the admin page. Some of these features may or may not show up for you if you don't have all of the different permission levels. Other functions here in the admin include linking your properties to other Google products, setting goals, configuring filters, and how to manage your individual user settings here on the top left corner. And with that, we've gone over the basic layout of the Google Analytics interface, and you should now be able to navigate safely across the platform. We spend most of our time here in the reports section. Let's go ahead and take a high-level look at the types of reports that are available to us in Google Analytics, what data they report on, and how they differentiate from each other. The real-time reports section here, it's useful as it shows what's happening on our site right now. These are essentially stripped-down versions of the various Google Analytics reports that are simplified to show a very quick snapshot in time. Through this course, we'll examine the full version of each of these reports in depth. So we're not going to dive in here deeper at the moment other than to point out that these exist. And to be completely honest, unless you're launching a time-sensitive unveiling or something else where you would expect a flood of traffic, there isn't as much value here from an analysis point of view as you might think to see this snapshot in time versus what we really like are trends over time. So we're going to move on here to the 4 main reporting areas that we will be focusing on. That is the audience, acquisition, behavior, and conversions. Now, in the audience section, this provides insight into the characteristics of the users that visit your website. It's here where you can answer the question, who are my users? And this doesn't mean you'll literally be able to find out that John from apartment 3A is here, but the reports under the audience section return anonymous data on demographics, interests, geolocation, technology, and mobile devices. The acquisition section here explains how users are finding and reaching your website. How did you acquire those users? These include reports that are going to be broken down by traffic source and other campaign data. We can also view reports that are dedicated to search engine optimization and AdWords campaigns. As we went over in the previous video, you can link Google tools like AdWords to your Google Analytics properties through the admin tab, and I highly recommend you do that if you're using AdWords. Now down here in the behavior section, we can analyze and visualize how users are engaging with the site. Reports in this section give us details about the performance of our site content, the user engagement with that content, and the site search reports if you've set up Google Analytics with an internal search function on your site that you can understand how people are searching and what content they're finding with that and how well it's working. And last but not least, the conversion section. This houses reports about goals that you've set up, or e-commerce if you've enabled it for your profile, and the multi-channel funnel reports that are going to give you greater insights into how users are finding your site over time, which of those channels are working and which ones are actually converting and having people do the things that you want them to do. Okay, so there's obviously a ton of great information here. We want to dive into these. These reports are going to provide the majority of the information that will provide the foundation of our analysis going forward. As we dive into the reports, we need to take a brief moment to talk about how they're organized and some terminology. Metrics and dimensions are the ways the reports are arranged, and they're extremely important concepts to understand when you're using Google Analytics. All the reports that you see are made up of them, so it's worth taking the time to point them out. A metric measures data. It's quantitative, so it's usually something you can count, and it's basically a number. Google Analytics provides both out-of-the-box default metrics and custom metrics you can configure that may apply to your very specific business needs. A dimension, on the other hand, describes data in groups of that data. Dimensions are qualitative. They can break down segments and metrics into these distinct categories. Dimensions and metrics go hand in hand. As dimensions break up the data into these categories, metrics can quantify that data so we're able to see the bigger picture. Okay, these are the academic definitions. It's probably easier to see this in an example. This is a common report in Google Analytics showing the top pages on the site and the metrics that are associated with those pages. In this report, the dimension is pages, which are the rows, and the metrics for that dimension are here in the columns. The number of page views of those pages, the unique page views, the time on those pages, the number of times where they were entrances, the bounce rate, times where they were the exit, and even the page value for each of those pages. So you see that these metrics are grouped by these pages. Now, another example is here where those same exact metrics, page views, unique page views, time on page, bounce rate, etc., they're going to be grouped instead by page title. So these are the titles of the pages. And because there are more than one page that has the title of home, those all get grouped together, and we see the total number of page views for those. So this is just one example, but here are some more common examples of metrics versus dimensions. Metrics can be page views, sessions, users, and we saw bounce rate before, conversion rate. The dimensions, the way we could group these could be by page, by device type, by country, by browser, by landing page. Even campaigns can have metrics. How many users did we get who came by a specific campaign? How many page views did we get associated with a certain page? And what we see here, we can combine these together in ways that make sense. Now, there is something else we should talk about when we talk about ways that make sense, our scope. Metrics and dimensions that work together have a certain scope. Scope is the property of the variable, either dimension or metric, that determines the level and value of the data is associated with. On Google Analytics, there are 4 levels of scope. There are hit, things that happen that are sent back as one individual piece of data, like a page view. Session, that would be all the things that happened as part of a visit. If I go browse a website, I view multiple pages, maybe I check out, I interact in different ways. All those things are associated with one single session. We also have user. If I come back multiple times and I visit a site multiple times, I'm going to have lots of hits. I could even have multiple sessions, but I'm still only ever one user. And lastly, we have product level scope. This is going to be things that are associated with that one particular product. Now, we're not going to focus too deeply on this concept. It's definitely past the essentials course, but it is important to know that in order to function properly, metrics and dimensions should come from the same scope. It should make sense. You can't really apply the number of page views, which would be a hit level metric that occurs when a user loads that page, with a campaign source, a session level dimension that describes the source from where a session originated. Now, in this example, it would make much more sense finding the number of page views across types of pages, both at the hit level and the number of users per each source, both within the session level scope. So in this case, a page would have a certain number of page views, and a source would have a certain number of users who come from that source. Okay, hopefully that didn't get too confusing, but I think it's worth the time to touch on these 3 very important concepts of metrics, dimensions, and scope, as they will govern so much of our analysis going forward. One feature that you're likely to see on almost every report in Google Analytics is the main data over time chart. This is the chart you'll see here where we've got data graphed over time. And this is great. It gives us a 10,000-foot view, but to really utilize it, we can configure it to show much more. For example, let's take a look at the audience report that shows website traffic by device category. This can be found under Audience, and we'll scroll down to Mobile, and we can look at the overview here. Now, this overview report can be useful to compare the traffic coming from mobile devices, desktop, and even tablets. I've adjusted the time period for this particular report up here in the top right corner. I'm also viewing this data in terms of days, which I set here, although I could set this in terms of weeks or even months. Particular report up here in the top corner. I'm also viewing this data in terms of days, which I set here, although I could set this in terms of weeks or even months. And you see if I do that, the visual representation of this here is going to change quite drastically here. For now, I'm going to go with the most granular one of a day because I've only got a couple of months here, 3 months, and so I want to be able to see individual days. But if we had a much longer time period, if we just wanted to see large trends, it might make sense to use one of the other two options. Even though this is a really simple report, we can get some insights out of this. For example, one of the things we can see here if we scroll down is that the number of users seems to fall off quite a bit over the weekend. So Saturday and Sunday, and then rises again on the week. So we see a very consistent, repeatable pattern here just with a brief look. So right now, this graph is set to users, which we can change with this drop down here. And what we're going to see are these drop downs. These are grouped the same way that these tabs up here are grouped. So we have e-commerce, goal set 1, site usage, and summary. So inside of these are going to be different metrics that are going to correspond to those. So in the site usage, we talk about sessions and bounce rates and users. In the e-commerce section up here, we would talk more about things around commerce, like average order value and revenue, transactions, things like that. So speaking of e-commerce, let's go ahead here and grab revenue and put the graph to revenue over time. Now, what's interesting, we see some spikes here. The most basic kind of analysis I want to rule out is whether there were simply more users on the days that had higher revenue. So I could try to think back to that users one, or I could actually put that right on top of it. I can go here to select a metric, come down to site usage, and I could grab users. In this case, what I really want to see is sessions. If I'm getting more sessions, I would assume I'm getting more transactions, and so I can overlay those. You see the light blue here are the number of sessions, and our existing dark blue is the number of revenue. So on this spike, we do indeed see that there are a high number of sessions on that day, but there are also a high number of sessions on the next day, and our revenue drops dramatically. So it's not always that the two are directly correlated. So this ability to change this graph and even put two different metrics on at the same time is something that's quite an underutilized feature. Most people look right past it. Now, another thing we can do, instead of comparing two different metrics, we can also compare two different time periods with a single metric. So I'm going to hit the X here that's going to clear out the sessions. I'm going to bring back my drop down and I'm going to say compare to previous period. And it's automatically going to set it to the same time period but a previous one. And if I say OK, it's going to overlay these on top of each other. It's going to be the same metric, revenue, but for the different time periods. So in blue, I see the one I originally had selected, April 15th or June 15th. And in orange, we have February 12th through April 14th, right up to that time period. This can be really useful for month over month, year over year, those kinds of type of analysis where we're trying to compare one time period against another for the same metric. Okay, taking away the compare time period one, another thing we can add to this is the ability to plot individual rows in addition to the overview. So for example, I could come down here and I can select desktop and I could select mobile and I can plot those rows. And what we see immediately is that there is almost no revenue coming from mobile. That green line is skidding down here along the bottom, barely skimming along, and almost all of the revenue overall is led by desktop. In fact, those two are almost an exact match. The only time I see here where they're not is on May 5th, where we had a slight increase in mobile, and therefore the desktop didn't entirely match the overall revenue, but everywhere else we can see that mobile's not really making a dent. Certainly something we want to analyze more closely, figure out why that might be, but this graph immediately shows us that insight. Okay, so the data over time graph is a staple of Google Analytics. It allows us to visualize our data quickly and effectively, and the customization options make it a more versatile tool than most people realize. Analytics can tell us what happened, but it often struggles with the why. As analysts, of course, that job falls to us. And it's incredibly useful for us to be able to provide our own context and provide more background about what's happening with our site so we can do that analysis easier. So in this case, we're looking at the revenue report from the last video, but over a longer time period. We can look along here, and one of the things I see is April 5th. It looks like the revenue shot up on that day. It went from about $10,000 to all the way up to $60,000. But why? We're not sure. Was there a great blog post? Did Google run a particularly effective ad campaign for the merchandise store? Was that the day that the site went haywire and counted every visitor and transaction 5 times? We don't know. As we research this, we'll want to treat the answers to that with as much care as we treat this original raw data. Particularly if we work in a group where multiple people will be accessing the same profiles, we can use annotations to inform them of these events, changes, and perhaps explain some of these anomalies to the site data once we've done our research so we don't have to do it over and over again. Now, if you work in a group, that's obvious, but I will say that even if you work alone, these can be extremely useful to help you remember 6 months from now what you changed today, what happened, why, and what the results of that research was. So you, again, don't have to do that all over again. So to help you in that, we can add some useful annotations to this graph and help us remember those significant events. To do so, I'm going to click on this little drawer icon down here. It's going to open up the annotations drawer. We can see there are a couple here already. Some Google employees have added a few of these. One on July 1st, we can see that from the little annotation icon here along the graph, as well as one on August 2nd. Now, I have the ability to go in and create a new one. I can click over here, create new annotation. There's going to be a date on here. We were going to put in that April 5th date. And we can say here that there was a link to the home page in an email blast. Now, there's visibility options here. We can do private. Private means that only the person logged into this account, so in other words, me, is going to be able to see these. So these are essentially a note to yourself. There's also shared. Shared means that anyone who has access to this profile is going to be able to view this. Now you see, we don't have access to do that on here because we don't have the right permissions. In order to create a shared one, you have to have the permission of collaborate or above on the entire view to add or modify these shared notes. We'll go into some permissions later, but you can always edit your own private annotations. Okay, so we go ahead and save that, and now we will have this annotation here for the next time we come back to this account and do this analysis. And we can use these annotations to document and show things like when the view changes were made. If we apply a filter, that's an important one. If we set up new goals, when we link an AdWords account, or if things in your business, like when you start advertising or when you enable e-commerce or make any other change to a view or account, you want to make sure you notate that here. We can also detect significant anomalies and maybe some of the possible causes. So if it's known, unknown, even suspected, any information that we have here that can help our future selves or the next person who is researching this, we want to go ahead and put that down. Annotations allow us to provide that context and the meaning to the data. It's going to save ourselves and our team a tremendous amount of research time, preserve that information for future analysis, and help us spot and explain some trends over time that may impact our business and our analysis, both for good and for bad. Google Analytics not only records the data for each visit, it gives us tremendous power and flexibility in how we can view and analyze the data that's being stored in this database. This video is going to show a few of the most common and useful ways we can view and visualize the data. So for example, let's start out here. We're down at the Channels report. We come under Acquisition, All Traffic, and click on Channels. Now, this is one of my favorite reports. In fact, this is the first one I'm going to go to if I have a new client because it provides so much information about the current state of the site and how they generate, engage, and convert their traffic, all in one convenient report. So we have all of our traffic segmented into these dimensions, these rows here, and the primary dimension is set as a default channel grouping that's going to represent the ways the visitor came to our site. And on the other side of the table, these columns or metrics are split into 3 sections that group their function. We have the acquisition, the behavior, and the conversions. For example, new users metrics tells us all about the traffic we are acquiring. And the average session duration speaks to the behavior of those users once they're on the site. And then the goal completions metric is going to tell us whether or not they converted once they were there. Now, this tabular format, it presents a lot of data, but for us humans, it's not particularly easy to remember, compare, and interpret this information when it's just a bunch of numbers in this big table. So Google Analytics gives us some idea of how to visualize this information. It's going to help us gain some of those insights. The first option is to take these numbers and turn it into a pie chart. Go ahead and click up here on the pie chart, and it will do that. Here we see our channel groupings just like we had before. We see the number of users, and we see that broken down visually here in the pie chart. So, of course, we see up here in the table that the majority here, 33,000 users come from organic search, and that's very obvious if we look in the pie chart. We can see that. Then we see there are 3 more that make up about an equal percentage of each other, and then a whole bunch of those kind of also-rans here that are a much smaller percentage. If we look down the numbers, we see that that follows here as well. Now, if you don't like pie charts, many people don't, if you prefer bar charts, we can do that as well. Click on the bar charts, and we get that exact same thing here. We see this visually represented. And the problem I have with this is that we have these numbers and then we see essentially the exact same thing over here again. What we can do is we can take advantage of the fact that we have two columns and we can understand one from a quality metric and one from this quantity. For example, instead of repeating users here again, what if I switch to something like bounce rate? Okay, so now what I have here is an understanding of the quality, bounce rate. We know that bounce rate is generally a good metric, meaning we want to have a lower bounce rate. And then over here we see the percentage of people. This is still based on users. So while this may have an incredibly high bounce rate, it also has a very low percentage of the users. And down here in referral, we see a very low bounce rate, not quite as much traffic, and then somewhere in the middle here, the vast majority of our users have a somewhat middle of the road bounce rate. Now, performance is really what we're focusing on here. So we have volume on the right, we have the performance on the left. And so if I look at these, one of the questions we have is, well, I'm not sure if these are good or bad bounce rates. One of the things we can do is switch to the next one, which is a comparison, and it's going to tell us how this compares to site average. So again, we want to switch this metric to something like bounce rate. And so here we'll see the number of users, and then we'll see the bounce rate for each of those. So what do we see right away is that there are only two of these that are in the green, the direct and the referral. Another thing that I see is that referral and social, these are going to bring about the same amount of traffic to the site, but they perform very differently once they get to the site in terms of referral having a relatively low bounce rate and social having a very high bounce rate. So even though they bring the same amount of traffic, what they're worth to me is very different. Now, speaking of worth, we can also switch this to something like e-commerce conversion rate. And now this is interesting here. We see a huge discrepancy between social and referral here for that last click conversion rate. In fact, we can switch this to total revenue. Come down here. And we can see that the per visit conversion rate is so good for this referral channel that despite the relatively smaller number of visitors, it contributes more overall revenue as a channel than anything else by far. Now, if you want to take this to the next level, you can come over here to the pivot. And we can see the same kind of notion where we have quality and quantity by saying users there. And let's take bounce rate here. And we see those. Or actually, let's go ahead and look at revenue. And we can group this. Right now, we've got it again by these channels. But we could do something completely different. For example, we could put in here by country. And now we can see the default channel grouping over here of the rows, and then we can see the countries here, and for each country we can see both the quantity and the quality. And what's interesting, things that jump out here, for example, there are twice as many people coming from India, but absolutely no revenue, versus Canada only gets half the users. And one might think, oh, I'm only getting half the traffic from Canada, but tons more revenue here, right? So we actually have attributed revenue, both quality and quantity, versus lots of quantity, but no performance coming from that. And lastly, up here, we have the term cloud. And this is basically just a word cloud. I think this is honestly borderline useless in most cases. So these aren't the most useful for analysis, but it's here if you want it. Okay, hopefully you're becoming more comfortable with how to navigate the basic visualization options. As we get deeper into our analysis, we'll find out that we can uncover far more actionable data if we know how and when to take advantage of each of these options. Inline filters are a simple but powerful tool to allow us to quickly control and consolidate the data that we're analyzing in the data table and all the graphs. Before we begin, let's talk about terminology. There are three primary types of filters: view filters, quick inline filters, and the advanced filters. Let's actually start out by pointing out the filters we're not going to talk about in this video so we don't get into trouble. If we take a look at the view settings down here in the admin, come over here to the view and come down here to an area called filters. Where we see some advanced filters here, these are going to affect the views. It's going to actually keep the data from getting into the view. And frankly, these are pretty dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. We'll discuss these over in the advanced Google Analytics course, but we're going to go ahead and back away from these for now, as these are not the subject of this video. When we talk about inline or advanced filters, we're actually not talking about these views at all, but just the reports that we're going to take a look at. So if we come down here to the audience and then down to geo, let's take a look at the language. These are going to have the browser languages of all the people visiting our sites. And up here, this box, this is our inline filter box. Now let's say we want to look at all the different folks who have Spanish set on their browser. Now we could just come down here and click would filter everything that we see here only to the folks that have Spanish, and we would see all the scorecard and metrics. The problem is there's more than one kind of Spanish reported. So if we head back over there, a better way to do that is to simply put yes here in the filter return, and then we see all the different variations of Spanish. We have just the ES, we have Spain Spanish, we have Mexican Spanish, Argentinian Spanish, and so on. Now from here, we're able to evaluate these individually. I can see each of these rows and the metrics that go with there, and we can also see them summed up as well. When I change this filter up here, all of the summation metrics up here in the scorecard are reflected for just what's shown here in the data table, as well as our data over time graph. Now, besides convenience, the beauty of having this fully calculated in the scorecard is that even the mental math whizzes can't just sum these all up, because things like bounce rate are just sums. So these calculations at the top are great for getting the entire segment while not sacrificing any of the granular data below. And there are tons of uses for this type of filtering in these reports. Let's take a look at some more. If we click on over to the source medium report under acquisition, all traffic source, and source medium, here we're going to see the different sources and mediums that bring traffic to the site. Maybe your question is, how many Google pages are bringing traffic to our Google merchandise store? Well, if we simply go here and type in Google, it will restrict the report where the source medium has to have Google in it. And we see there are lots of them here. Now these are cases where Google was in the domain of the source that brought traffic here. And again, just like before, the scorecard and the data over time graph will update to reflect the overall aggregate numbers for these Google pages all put together. So these inline filters are great for quick manipulation of the data. They take less than 5 seconds to achieve a lot of data cleanup. In the next video, we'll show you how to make this even more powerful with inline advanced filters. Previously, we did a quick inline filter to show Google as a source. But Google can be an organic search engine as well as just a page on google.com with links to our store. We may want to distinguish between the two. So we'll still be looking for Google as a source in that case, but with the medium of referral, since that's how Google Analytics indicates a link was clicked or referred. Now there are a few ways to do this, but one is the advanced filter. So we come over here to where the inline filter was and we click on advanced. It'll bring this drop down here, and we've got a few more options. Now just like before, we want to include a source and medium containing Google, but we want to do an and here, and we're going to do another source medium here where it contains referral. Go ahead and apply that. Now we can see that any mediums that weren't referral have been excluded, and we're able to surface lots of these pages with less traffic than otherwise would have been maybe lost in the noise. Now, going back to this, if we click Edit, we can see it again. A couple things to point out here. First, we want to make sure we can include or exclude the traffic that we're identifying here. There are a few different options that we've got. We chose containing, and we're going to give you an example of the regular expressions in just a minute, but there are a few other options you can put as well. Now, one thing you won't see here is an or. So I can't say that I want to include this or this. So for example, let's say that I wanted to include traffic from YouTube and from Facebook. Now, although I said and, what I really should have said was or. YouTube or Facebook, because it's actually impossible to have traffic from YouTube and from Facebook here. And so, of course, we get 0 down here. I don't have an option for an or, but if I clear this out, what I do have up here is a regular expression. And we won't get too far into those, other than to say there are a bunch of little characters that can do interesting things. One of those is called the pipe character. It's just a vertical bar. It's usually above the enter key. And that is effectively an or. So we can say, I want to match YouTube or Facebook. And when we go ahead and apply that, what we see down here is traffic that's only from YouTube or Facebook. Okay, so let's play around a little bit more. We've gone over filtering by the primary dimension, but as you can see, we can filter over here by some metrics as well. So to do that, we don't just have the dimensions, but we can identify a metric. Let's say, for example, sessions. We could do sessions greater than 100. What I think is actually really interesting is that we can even do filters here on data that we don't see down here in the table. For example, we could come down here to an e-commerce metric and we could take average order value. We could say, I want to see everything from YouTube or Facebook with an average order value of greater than $10. Go ahead and apply that. As we see here now, there's only 2 source mediums that are either from Facebook or YouTube and have an average order value of greater than $10. There's all kinds of other data that's associated with these visits, and we can filter on that as well. Like so many tools that are powerful analysis, most users simply have no idea they're there. But now you do, and I'm convinced you'll use these over and over now that you see the power and you know how to do it. Segmentation is the first step in true analysis, and we have tons and tons of ways to segment users in Google Analytics. We'll look at each of these in detail throughout this course, but for now I'd like to touch on the types of segments we're going to be looking at, give you a little bit of a preview, and the key idea here is that we're going to stop looking at all of our visitors as one big homogeneous entity, and instead we're going to dive in and compare them and group them so we can better understand them, and that we're better poised to take action and optimize our site and our business. One of the most common differentiators that comes to mind when we think of the different groups of visitors to our site is where they're from geographically. There are plenty of ways for us to break down how different users from different parts of the world interact with our site. Google Analytics allows you to view audience data as a whole at the world view, as we see here, or we can drill down into each country, we can go into each region or state, and go down as far as into the city itself. Traffic channels are another critically important segment that splits users up by channel in which they came. Now, how many conversions came from organic search? How did it compare to traffic that came from social media? We'll also want to segment out our visitors who do certain things on our site. The traffic segment that completes a checkout is certainly different from the traffic segment who came in and immediately hit the back button. And I'd like to know more about what made them have such completely different reactions. One of the ways we can segment is by intent. And the keywords that users type into search engines can give us some insight into that intent. Now, granted, we can't get as much from the organic or free search as we used to, but we still have full access to search advertising and the searches that occur on our own sites, which may be just as interesting. As we examine the events that led up to your arrival on the site, we can compare that to the landing page you hit when you arrive on our site. The combination of those 2 factors can give us great insight into your motivations, and they can reveal a clue about why the user's visit might be very successful or not, and thus the ability to segment by landing page can be pretty revealing. Even with seemingly small things like the type of browser, that can shed light on the visit itself. After all, what do we know about a large percentage of Safari users? They're on Mac, right? Now, Mac users are certainly a different segment. Apple ran an entire ad campaign focusing on just how different that segment is. But even beyond the operating system, we know that folks took the time to install Firefox or Chrome, or at least savvy enough to do so. They also cared enough about their browsing experience to take the time to customize it versus using just the default that came with the computer. And of course, Safari is not Safari because Safari on a MacBook is very different than Safari on an iPhone, and both are important to analyze. And beyond just this idea of mobile versus desktop, we can get detailed reports that tell us things like the connection speed, the screen resolution, and other segmentation information that's going to help us design sites that are optimal for our user base. And if nothing else, we can simply split the site into two groups: those who reached our goals versus those who didn't. Just as examining successes or failures in any aspect of life is useful, examining successful and unsuccessful visits to our site can give us insight into how we can optimize and improve. Now, if you're split testing your ads, and by the way, if you're not, you should be, then we'll want to understand how the segments that saw one ad performed better than another. These are just a few of your segmentation and sub-segmentation options. The options are really nearly endless, and they're going to depend greatly on what analysis you're performing, and most importantly, the questions you're trying to answer. The main point here is to start thinking in terms of, how do I want to slice up this data? What dimensions do I want to see, and how do I want to segment those? And will I want to segment again after that? Google Analytics helps you answer this with their pre-segmented reports that are laid out in the major tabs that we're going to see, but you also have the ability to create your own segments to break up your data. We're going to go over this in just a bit. We said that segmentation is the key and the first step to any analysis. Now, Google Analytics is overloaded with segmentation options for us to isolate those certain groups of traffic. For example, it's easy to come here in the location report. We go into our audience, and then down here into geo and location. And here we can see our users split out by country, or we could select city. Or, as we've seen before, we could head over here to acquisition, to one of my favorite reports, the channels report, to understand how our users are coming to our site. We can individually click on one of these, and we can see a subsection of those, so where exactly the landing page that they're coming into these direct ones are. But what if you want to combine these? Going back to the main channel report, what if you wanted to see the most popular countries that users are from that reach the website from these particular channels? Coming back here and click all, that will bring me back to the main channels report. Well, in order to do that, what I could do is add a secondary dimension. I've got my primary dimension here, the channel grouping, but I could go to a secondary dimension, type in country, and what we'll see here is you'll see the largest percentage of these users are coming in through organic search and from the United States. The next one, direct United States referral. But the fourth one here, organic search, India. Okay, so that'll split these out by these permutations. But what if I just was interested in users from the United States here in the channels report? Now, sure, I could come up here to the advanced filter like we saw before. I could select country matching exactly the United States and see only the traffic broken up from US users, but that would only go for this report. If I know that I want to continue this analysis of this segment through multiple reports, there's actually an easier way to tell Google Analytics that you'd like to apply this segment to your entire analysis. And you can segment not just by one demographic, but all kinds of aspects, depending on how we want to isolate that target group. So what we're going to do is we're going to come up here to the top, and where we see this all users next to there, we're going to click Add Segment. When we open that up, we see the different segmentation options here. In the system option, there are the ones that are kind of pre-done. These are out-of-the-box segments that Google's already created for you for use with this demo account. You can scroll through these and take a look. Most of them are fairly self-explanatory, mobile and tablet traffic, or people who made a purchase, people who converted, that kind of thing. But the real power comes when you can start to create your own. So let's do that. Let's come up here and create a new segment by, of course, clicking the New Segment button. And that's going to open up this dialog box. So we have some demographic options. Let's go first name this, and that'll give us an idea what we're after here. Let's say we want U.S. male, English language, users, ages 25 to 34, and they're running Windows OS. Okay, so we said 25 to 34. We said male. We said that we wanted the language to contain English, and I'm going to say all kinds of English. From there, we don't know what the browser is going to say exactly. And we said US, but we're going to specify US, not with the language on the browser, but coming down here and selecting country contains. As we start typing, it'll give us the options, in this case, United States. And the last one is we need to switch over here to the technology. We said the operating system was going to be Windows. And for now, we don't want Windows Phone. We just want, well, actually, this will catch both of them. So this is anything that has Windows in there. Okay, so we've created our segment here. Fairly simple. We just laid out the options that we want. Click Save. And there you go. This is our new segment. We see down here that this is going to apply only folks that match this. So you can see these are only going to be United States because we've already selected that here inside of our segment. And we see all the different channels that they're coming through. So in this case, I could take away the country as a secondary dimension because it's just validating what we've done, but not providing any other data. Now, if we want to compare this against all of these, we can come back here and we can select all users if we want to understand how people are comparing to that. So we select all users in our segment. We apply that as well. Now, in this particular case, we can see up here that my first segment, the users that are the US male English language, are such a small percentage of the traffic compared to all the users that it's not a very useful way to do the analysis. It's about 1% of these, but again, you can add these segments on top of each other and it will allow you to compare one versus the other inside of the same analysis. Okay, so that's your segmentation. Now you can see how powerful this is when you can apply these custom segments and break the data in your analytics reports. This really is one of the most critical tools in the analyst toolbox. These segments are a great way to find information on a specific audience without having to apply a permanent view filter, and they can really help tell the story of that segment across numerous reports as you go through. So we've looked at some of the interface tools, and as such, we've viewed a couple of these reports as examples. But now it's time to dig into the reports themselves in a bit more detail. If you still have your segment enabled from the last video, you probably want to go back to the All Users one here for the time being as we look through this. Now the reports we're going to look at here are in the Audience tab in the left-hand navigation. And we first click on Overview. These are going to give us some of the most sought-after information about the number and types of users visiting your site. They're going to help us as analysts paint the story behind who these users really are. And in here, your audience is going to be segmented by useful dimensions such as demographics, location, device type, and even their interests. Overall in this chapter, I'm going to go over some of these commonly used essential audience reports and how to utilize them to best extract the most useful data for your analytics needs. Now, in this video, I'm going to introduce all of these reports to you so you have enough of a foundational overview and you can come back and choose to look deeper into the reports that are best suited for your own objectives. So at the top here, we have the audience overview, which we're going to go over in the next video. The overview contained in all these sections provides a condensed report with a variety of the key metrics across a given section. So next, we have the active users report, where you can see the number of active users on your site, 1 through 28-day periods. And here you can see if you're able to retain the same level of user interest across different periods of time, or if you need to optimize your site to attract more users overall, or even users within a certain segment. And you can select each of these as you like. The next two reports down here are both in beta at the time of this recording. You have the lifetime value report. Here you can analyze the lifetime worth of users coming into your website from different channels and sources, mediums, and campaigns, instead of just a single session. With the cohort analysis, you're going to isolate different cohorts or groups of users who have a common first visit date and analyze their behavior. This is useful if you run campaigns in flights or if you want to understand the customer life cycles. Next, we have the new Audiences report. It's a little bit outside the scope of this course, but it's going to allow you to create audiences, which are done at the property level within the admin page. Look over here. If you go to admin and then the property, come down here to audience definitions. These are going to be very similar to how we did segments in the last video. Instead of just using them within Google Analytics, though, you can use them across all the Google tools. For example, if you wanted to specify who you want to show advertising to with AdWords and then analyze the results of those ads, you can create them here in the admin section. You do need edit permission at the property level to create those audiences, and then you have to link them to AdWords per the on-screen instructions here. Now, beyond here, we get into sections that have sub-reports in here and subcategories that further segment the data available here. Now, remember, I'll be going over many of these within this chapter, so we're going to breeze through a couple here. But overall, the demographics reports can help you understand your users based on age and gender. These variables can be something to think about when you're considering designing the creative content on your site or where you place your ads. The interest report lets you group together users by interests that they've expressed. These are through the affinity categories, in-market segments, or other categories. The geo reports, you can see your audience by language and location. These reports can help you discover users from different geographic areas, maybe that are on your radar or that are interested in your business. Who are returning users, how frequently they're visiting your site, and a basic overview of how they're engaging with your site. The technology reports explore technologies such as browsers that people are using to reach and consume your content. These reports allow you to understand how your site is performing across these browsers, operating systems, networks, devices, where you can fine-tune your versions and really understand what to focus on for your future implementations. Now, separate from the technology section, though, is the mobile, which in and of itself has a ton of data that you can access and analyze. In the mobile reports, you can see not only who's on a mobile device, but also the wide variety of mobile devices that are being used, the brands they fall under, and even the service providers associated with the device. Custom reports allow you to extend the scope of your segments with custom variables. Again, those are going to be configured in the admin page, although we'll generally steer you to custom dimensions instead. The benchmarking section down here, you can compare your data with other companies in the industry, according to Google, who share their data. Now, these reports can be super helpful providing the context for how you are doing compared to others, so long as there is a benchmark that you fit into. If you're a kind of a one-off unique company, then it won't work, as there is a certain number that have to be in there in order for them to show you their data. And lastly, in the user flow report, it can display a graphical visualization of the user journeys on your site and help give you an idea of the many paths that users can take, starting from a landing page through to where they exit the session. Again, we'll go over this in more detail. Now, one of the main disadvantages of a digital versus a brick and mortar traditional business is that you can't see and interact with your customers to really kind of get to know them. All of these audience reports can help you understand your audience, which is obviously very critical for marketers. Let's begin with the Audience Overview report. Here we see a condensed report of the standard high-level metrics that are contained within this audience section. At the top, we have our standard date over time graph here, which we've got defaulted to users, but of course we can choose any metric that we like there. And as we scroll down, we see the mini reports that are kind of a preview to the more detailed reports in the audience section. For the table below, you can switch these dimensions between the demographics, the systems, and the mobile reports via these links on the left-hand side. Now, these mini reports are going to give us a snapshot of the audience all in one page here in a single view. For the most part, we don't do a ton of analysis here in these overview pages, but if we dig a little deeper, there are some insights we can gain here in the overview, especially if we start using date range comparisons. So I'm going to go up and select that. Let's do a compare to previous. It will automatically select the previous month. And I'm going to switch this to week to get more of a high level. Now, if we scroll down, what we see is it's going to calculate the difference for us. We can quickly discern a few things. We see we actually started out with more users last month, more than twice the amount of users actually, but we can see that the users leveled off pretty quickly. If we look at the numbers below here, we can see a comparison of important metrics. Now, there wasn't too much of a change between the periods. However, the number of overall users, new users, and sessions did drop by 10 to 13%. Pages per session went up, the bounce rate decreased, which is a good thing, and so this may mean our traffic was a bit more engaged in the previous period at least. We can look for a few more clues below. If we switch this over to the city demographic, we can see if traffic maybe changed drastically from one city to the other. What we see here is that San Francisco went up quite a bit. I see a big drop in Mountain View. Those are actually similar areas. And then down here at Chennai, we see a 125% increase. So something we can dive into a little bit further in our analysis. The overview report does a good job what it's meant to. An overview of the audience reports. Realistically, like I said, I don't spend a ton of time on here from an analysis point of view. I tend to jump into the individual reports over here on the left-hand side, inside of the meat of the audience section where the real analysis takes place, and that's where we're going to head now. The demographics and interest reports are a great way to get started with the audience section and help you get a baseline of who your users are. We're in the test account I created not too long ago, and I haven't touched it since. You may notice when you first enter the demographics overview report here, you get this screen instead of a standard report. This is because we haven't enabled the demographics and interest reports yet, and therefore Google Analytics can't track and record those standard demographics about our users. So be sure to read through the fine print here about privacy when it comes to these advertising features. Then you can enable demographics and interest reports. Now, you can also enable or disable these features in the admin tab under the property settings if you later change your mind. Now, the reason you have to enable this is Google's going to join the data you collect on your site with the data that it already knows about these users through their DoubleClick products. Now, that's how you get the demographics data. You aren't actually asking and collecting it on your site. Google's going to offer what it knows or can reasonably guess about your users, but first you have to give them the permission to do so and abide by their privacy policy and so on. Now, to that end, these reports are not perfect. They are not down to the individual granularity, always correct, but they are in some cases an educated guess by Google, so we can take them as such, but they're better than nothing and they can often shed some light on things you otherwise wouldn't know about your users. Okay, now we're going to switch back to the demo account that does have these things populated. We start here at the overview. We see two very basic representations, a bar chart of the user traffic split by age groups and a pie chart of the traffic split by gender. Now you can see the percent sampled in the total visits as well in the top right here of each chart. This overview has set the default metric of users, but you can of course change this to whatever you like. You could also add a segment at the top of this to determine the age and gender comparison with some more defined audiences if you want to choose a particular segment to analyze. Now if we move over to the age report, we have access to some really useful information here on age. Here in the data over time graph, we're going to see something different. You're going to see a stacked line graph composed of the different age brackets that make up the total number of users laid out across this time period and how each of them make up from an age point of view. If you hover over here, you're going to see a breakdown for each of these. Now, you can manipulate this data in many ways to find what we're after here. Say we're only interested in the age group of 25 through 34. We can deselect the rest of these and decide to plot rows with just that particular age group. It's going to show us our total users and then show us how that particular age group lines up here. So it looks like this is, a pretty good chunk of our users. And of course, if we look down here, yes, we do see it's about 44% of the users during this time. So I want to see how these users are going to impact revenue. So I can go ahead and add a second metric here to compare users with the revenue. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Unsurprisingly, we're going to choose revenue. And now what's going to happen is the graph is going to populate the total revenue from just that age group here. Now, this is a little bit busy. I think what I want to do is put this onto weeks so we can see a little bit clearer what's happening here. So in dark blue, we've got users. In light blue, we see the revenue. And then in the orange and the light orange, we see the users and revenue from just the segment that we were analyzing at the time. So we can see here while our users held steady, our revenue took a big drop, but it wasn't from our 25 to 34-year-olds as those again held steady, and we also saw the revenue mostly hold steady. So some insights to be gained here. Next, we're going to go down here to the gender report. We have the exact same functionality in terms of isolating each gender, breaking them down by metrics, and visualizing any of these changes over time in the graph above. I can also add a secondary dimension like the familiar age brackets that we just saw. Come up here, add the secondary dimension. If I want to further segment the data by gender and age. Now we can see insights like the majority here, the top three of our users are male, ages of 18 to 44 in these top three rows. We can also take a look at the important quality metrics like conversions. I'm going to collapse this left-hand one so I can see over here, as well as I'm going to click on e-commerce so I can see e-commerce values by default. So give me these three. Now, if I were to sort by, say, e-commerce conversion rate by clicking on this one here, we'll see something a bit different. Our top two here, still the males 35 through 54, but the males 18 through 24 dropped all the way down here to 8th place and have a pretty low number comparatively. So lots of users, but not a lot of transactions. So go ahead, take some time to play around with these demographics and insights reports. They're a really great place to start analyzing the audience section, and they can help you make some inferences about the users visiting your website with some information Google provides that you might not otherwise have. One of the most interesting things to consider about our visitors is simply where they're from, geographically speaking, when they're visiting our site. And we consider this segment all the time in the offline world, but it's a little bit trickier on the web, where our content is accessible to the whole world with ease. Now, Google uses some pretty sophisticated technology to determine, as accurately as possible, where the geographic location of your user is, and they record that data as part of the visit. So let's come here and navigate to these particular reports. We're in the audience reports under Geo on location. Here we see a graphical representation of a map of the world. And the metric we're evaluating currently is users, although we can change this to what we like. And the darker areas here represent more users in this case. You can see down here in the legend, the lighter areas here are 1 user, and the darkest represent 26,000 users for this particular time period. Now we see this dark, but if we scroll down, we see a data table that's going to give us that exact same information, of course, quite a bit more from a metrics point of view. We've got our standard acquisition, behavior, and conversion metrics. Now, if we go up here, within these countries, we can drill down. So if I click on the United States, it's going to blow up this map to the United States, and then my thing that I can drill down to here are the individual states. So again, we'll see the data table down here is going to be updated to reflect that, and then if I were to click into a particular state, I'm going to see that state blown up, and then the individual metro regions. Now, what I can see on the map here is these are heavily located around the San Francisco Bay Area. And of course, if I scroll down, that's exactly what I see. San Francisco, Sunnyvale, Mountain View, San Jose, Palo Alto, Santa Clara. Those are all Bay Area cities. Now, if I want to pop that back up, I can come back here and click on country, and it will go back up to that higher view. Now, looking at this data table down here, one of the things I can't help but notice is the states with the largest populations are also the states with the most users. California, New York, Texas, Illinois, Florida. Kind of makes sense. If you have the most population, you're more likely to have more users. So that's kind of just a thing that we have to understand when we're looking at an overall user quantity. But we could take this to a per user metric. For example, one of the things we could look at would be like per session value. This is going to tell us how much people are spending per session, regardless of the overall number. And here we see a very different one. California is not nearly as dark here. In fact, a tinge darker than the rest. But we see, for example, Virginia sticks way out here at $42. And that may be interesting because if people are spending a lot per session and we can do things like pay-per-click marketing where we're going to pay per each session, this may be really interesting to know. We could also take this to look at engagement. So maybe we looked at something like duration. So average session duration. And then what we see here, the one that really sticks out, Vermont. Now there's some very engaged users here from Vermont, which is interesting because what I remember from we saw the users was Vermont was nowhere in here. In fact, if we put this down to show all the states, Vermont is down here absolutely dead last. So even though they have very few users, the users who do come are super engaged. Now, as potentially illuminating as these geo reports can be, one limitation we have to be aware of is that it is by no means 100% accurate. If you're connecting through a network, such as a corporate VPN, then the address that Google sees may be located in an entirely different city, such as the headquarters of your company, rather than where you're currently located when you started the session. So that can be a false location. It's also possible Google is simply unable to figure out where the visitor is located, and so it didn't know where to put it in. This is where you might see a not set in the data table. User location is simply not able to be determined. As we see here, the 10th highest one on here is not a state at all. In fact, it's not set. What that means is they were able to figure out that it was somewhere in the United States, but were not able to locate it to a particular state. Now, overall, the geolocation report can be a fantastic source of information once we learn to get past the less useful aggregate metrics and into those details where the true insights lie. When making design considerations and the trade-offs about how we build our sites, it's useful to be armed with information about the technology that our users are using to access the site. This next set of reports in the technology section, they can offer up a great deal of information to help us design and build an optimal site for our users. We can head over here to these browser reports in the audience, technology, browser, and OS. Now, the individual reports here are going to be first sorted by browser as a primary dimension. And then we have the same metrics here. We have our acquisition, behavior, and conversion metrics as always. This browser report is going to tell us the different browsers that are in use on our site. And one of the most common mistakes in site design is to create a site that has problems working in all the different browsers, known as cross-browser compatibility issues. But even if your site doesn't work at all on a particular browser, users on that browser won't know until they actually visit the site, or try to anyway. So you can't rely on the users column to necessarily tip you off that there's a problem, particularly if you have a high percentage of new users, because while a visitor may not choose to return to a site that doesn't display properly, a new user's never visited your site before, so they have no knowledge of that issue, so they couldn't possibly avoid your site because of a problem they don't yet know about. However, we might be alerted to that problem by looking for evidence that users with that browser are having unsuccessful visits. We see that by shifting over here to the behavior, the conversions, or even the e-commerce metrics, and looking for browsers with suspiciously low value in those quality metrics, such as e-commerce conversion rate, for example. Let's go ahead and close the column over here that shows the reports, and we're going to see all of these here. I'm also going to click on e-commerce, and that will bring up e-commerce conversion rate. Now, if I sort by e-commerce conversion rate, first I'll get the highest conversion rates, but if I get the lowest conversion rate, it's going to show me the browsers that had unsuccessful visits. The problem is we're going to see a bunch of these here with strange names or extremely low numbers of users, and I'm probably not going to redesign my entire site around these. So what I want is a low conversion rate, but with a reasonable amount of users. There's a drop down here that says weighted sort. That's what we want, is a weighted sort. It's going to allow us to basically take into account the number of users when it figures out how to sort this by low. And so we see is the top one is not actually the lowest e-commerce conversion rate, but it's the lowest one of those that have a significant amount of visits. And Safari at the top, well, it's converting okay, but we do see some down here, for example, Opera Mini, that has over 1,000 visits, but no conversion rate whatsoever. So there may be an issue here that we need to look into. Now we can also inspect this not just by browser, but by operating system as well. Here we see Windows, Android, iOS, Samsung, and the like. We can also segment here by adding secondary dimensions. So we could, for example, look at language, and we could figure out Windows users who have Spanish set to the browser, for example. The combinations here are endless, and if you spend the time, you can likely find a report that gives you exactly what you're looking for in your data, especially when it comes to how we should be designing those sites. So hopefully by now you see how utilizing these technology reports can help us build sites that are optimally designed for the user's environments, and we can significantly improve the success of our sites by doing so. Analyzing mobile traffic to your site is one of the most important things a modern marketer can do. You can, of course, apply mobile segments, as we saw earlier. I remember that's up here in the top in the segmentation. But Google Analytics also provides these two mobile-specific reports that help us analyze just mobile traffic. If we come on down here to the mobile reports, click on Mobile Overview. This report, as all overviews, is going to allow us to quickly isolate the different types of traffic by device, and we're going to be able to evaluate that traffic against total sessions, bounce rate, revenue generated, and so on. Now, if we use the Plot Rows functionality to check these boxes here, and click Plot Rows, we can even see how each type of those stacks up against the desktop and the overall users. In this graph up here, we see the total number of users stacked by desktop and mobile users. It's interesting to see how the number of mobile users is pretty stable throughout the month, but desktop users contribute to that trend of greater sessions during weekdays and lower on weekends. So what we think is when people are at work, they tend to use desktops, as to where the mobile traffic doesn't really seem to change too much from weekend to weekday. We can also come back to this idea of quantity versus quality. Let's uncheck these except for desktop, plot those, and then take a secondary metric of revenue. So again, we have the overall users in dark blue, and then the revenue from those users in light blue. And then we've segmented out to desktop users in the dark orange and the revenue from just those desktop users in the light orange. We see some interesting things here. Users and desktop users tend to mirror each other a bit, but the revenue has some significant spikes to it. It doesn't necessarily correlate it back to the users exactly. Now, if we want to get even more information about the mobile ones in particular, we can check out this devices report. Here we can evaluate mobile traffic by the device used, and we have all these different metrics that are associated with each one of those devices. Now, those are specific devices. If we want to see just the brand, we can come over here and look at mobile device branding. And then instead of the individual ones, it'll just say the Apple, the Samsung, the Google, and so on. If we want to know more about Apple versus Android, we can come over here and click on operating system. And that's going to tell us what's iOS versus Android. What's interesting about that is we see that there's more Android phones up here when we look at them all bunched together. But if we looked at individual ones, we would see that Apple has a top spot and the Android ones are spread throughout several. We can also see the service provider. This is basically the cell phone company or the network provider through there. The mobile web is extremely important now that mobile has surpassed desktop use, and these reports are going to help us understand how more mobile users are interacting with our site. I highly suggest you check them out. If I could pick only one section to do all my work, it would be the acquisition section. Whenever I examine a client's account for the first time, these reports are the first place I go to see where users are really coming from and whether there may be any missed opportunities in bringing more engaged traffic to the site. And to really understand the difference these reports can make, it's worth stepping back and looking at things in perspective. There's a very famous person in the business world many of you may know by the name of John Wanamaker. He's a very successful retail magnate, and one of the things he's famous for is the phrase, "I fully believe half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half." And back in his day, this was just sort of accepted as a cost of doing business. I mean, you couldn't not advertise. It wasn't really an issue because the playing field was level. Everybody had the same problem, just sort of not advertising at all, and there wasn't a lot you could really do about it. But with the tools at our disposal, this just isn't true anymore, particularly in the world of digital. With accurate analytics on my site, I can evaluate my marketing campaigns and understand exactly which ones are working and which ones aren't. I know with fairly high precision where the money I'm spending on campaigns for my site is effective and where it's not. So I don't have to waste half the money on advertising because I simply can't track which ones are bringing in more engaged traffic and which ones aren't. In other words, accurate analytics is a major competitive advantage. You do have to take the time, though, to learn how to interpret these reports and metrics to get the real value. So let's go into the tool and introduce the acquisition section. Here at the left-hand navigation panel, we've come down here to the acquisition section, and we've got these into different sections. We've got the all traffic, Google Ads, Search Console, Social, and finally the campaigns. We start here in our overview report to get a taste of what kind of data is available to us under these acquisition reports. And we get a nice graphical overview with an incredibly valuable bird's eye view of the traffic that drives your site. Now, at the top of the report, you can change your primary dimension here from default channel grouping to source, medium, or some combination of the two. Now, we'll go over the difference between sources and mediums in a moment. The other thing that you can do is change your conversions here. This will normally be on goals. I like to switch this over to e-commerce if that's something you have on your site, because this is going to give us the ability to gather revenue, transactions, and other financial related data down here. Now, as you scroll down here, you're going to see the data table is going to be a little bit different than previous reports, and it shows a visual comparison of each channel by the acquisition, behavior, and conversion metrics. But I can click on each one of these and I can toggle not only which ones I want to bring in, but I can actually switch it over such that these will slide over and become the next one there. For example, if I click the number for new users, then not only is this going to make all the new users the numbers that we see here, but it's going to be represented by the bar charts as well. Same here, if I click sessions, and that one slides over, the bar charts are going to be updated as well as the numbers. And then same here for users. I can come over and do the same thing here. If I wanted to see the amount of revenue, I slide that on over, and then I can sort by that as well, and that will make each of these rows sorted by this particular column, but also update the numbers here. So it gives the ability to see both visual representation as well as the data charts, but you can operate these a little bit independently and customize this report as well. It's pretty neat. Now, in this chapter, we're going to go in depth with your traffic data in these various reports, focusing on these channels, the sources and mediums, and the referral reports. We're also going to touch on how to begin tracking your campaigns. While we won't really talk about the social or the AdWords in this Google Analytics Essentials course, it's important to note these acquisition reports can have a big impact on your analytics advantage, especially depending on your business model. And if you're interested in the analysis and optimization of AdWords, I highly suggest you check out the Linda course dedicated to just that. I think you'll agree that a few minutes of browsing these reports in this section can be invaluable for understanding where your traffic is coming from, which of course is a fundamental pillar of analysis. So let's dive in and learn more about the all traffic section under acquisition, beginning here with the channels report. In the channels report, under the all traffic dropdown, this is in the acquisition section here, we can see detailed metrics on the key channels that drive user traffic to the site. I'm going to go ahead and close this navigation panel so we have a little more room for our analysis. Now, anyone who's serious about digital marketing should be able to immediately answer questions such as, what is your best performing source of traffic? What is your worst? Which channel or medium sends you the most traffic? Which channel gets you the best bang for your buck? And even questions like, how is your offline marketing comparing to your online sources? All these are relatively easy once you get the hang of making these acquisition reports really work for you. In this case, we've got 7 channels here in the default channel category dimension. This is where we're going to group these different channels together. Sorting by the highest number of users, we're going to start with organic search here at number 1. This is the traffic that comes to your site by clicking on a standard search engine results page. Let's take an example of that. Let's say I go to Google and I do a search for graphic design tees. And we see on here on the top, these are sponsored. So all of these boxes here, these first 5, these are going to be ads. And then if we look down below this section, these are organic search results, sometimes called the natural results. Now, if I click on one of these ads at the top and I visit those websites, it's going to record my channel as paid search. So we have organic search down here by their kind of natural results, and then we have paid search in this as well. Both of these are going to be search engine results in the channel. However, if I were just to go up here and directly go to the site, let's say I just typed in cardboardpath.com and visit the site, I'm not coming from anywhere. I'm not clicking on any links. I'm not going to a search engine. I'm not clicking on a paid ad. I'm not clicking on organic search. I have just directly visited the site by typing in the URL. And this is most often how we see direct visits come in, but the truth is, it's just a lack of referring source information. So if for some reason Google Analytics was unable to determine the source, it would also get thrown in this direct bucket, just like if I typed it in here. So it's a lack of information about where it's coming from. The next one down are referrals. These are really just link clicks. They're just fancy names for referring traffic from a link. So if I went to a web page and you follow that standard HTML link, then you are referred by that link to the site. It'll be captured in this channel as a referral, and it knows which site is referring you over, which site has the link you clicked on. That's part of the HTTP protocol. The next one down here is social. These are social visits come from social media sites and posts. The affiliates channel designates them to come from affiliate marketing efforts. So in this case, the Google partners, the affiliates of Google and their merchandise. We saw in the search results, those are basically ads in the search engine. And lastly, display is advertising, but not necessarily search engine based. These are graphical ads that show up on sites around articles and other pieces of content. So if you click those display ads to come to our site, that click and everything you do in that session is going to be tracked here under the display category. Now, within this channels report, you can analyze these channels by the standard metrics we've discussed here. You got your acquisition, your behavior, and your conversions. You can also focus on the quantity metrics like users and sessions to see which channel brought the most visits. In this case, clearly organic contributed the most amount of traffic by quite a large margin. You can also look at the quality-based metrics that really show the value of these channels and the users that come from them. It doesn't do much good to send tons of traffic if no one buys anything from that traffic. So one thing we want to look at is, for example, here on referrals. And not only does this channel have the lowest bounce rate, one indication of quality at 20% here, but it also brings in the most revenue at $116,000, far above the others. Although they don't necessarily bring in the most traffic, this traffic is not only engaged in the website, but it's spending a lot more and converting really well. This is clearly a very important channel for us, and sorting by users might not be the smartest way to go. You can also drill into each channel to break up the data by the individual sources. So if we wanted to figure out what's going on in this referral channel, we can just click inside of it. Then it's going to view the looks like about 100 different sources here that are referring the user to the Google Merchandise Store. We can continue our analysis on which of these individual referral sources provided the best sessions to the site, the most revenue, or any of these other metrics we want to take a look at. Now remember, you can always go back to the top up here through the breadcrumbs just by clicking all, and that will back you out into the original report. Okay, clearly this is a very valuable report, one I suggest you take the time to really comb through. In the next video, we'll look at a similar but slightly different take on these traffic sources. The source medium report, found under the acquisition section within the all traffic dropdown, is very similar to the channels report, and its goal is to tell you the good, the bad, the ugly about how traffic gets to your site. Except instead of grouping it in large channels, it's more focused on identifying actual specific sources and mediums that users come across. So it's a bit more granular, and this ability to pinpoint sources of high quality traffic and separate them out from the poor performers is really going to be critical to our success. Now, first thing we need to talk about, how do you differentiate a source from a medium? Well, medium, the second one here after the slash, those describe how the traffic got to the site. They're a broad bucket, kind of similar to channels. We don't try to identify the exact email that sent the user to the site or the tweet, or even that it was Twitter. It's just social or email. The Twitter part is going to be taken care of in the sources, because the sources are the who. For that medium of social, who was it? Was it Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest? That's going to be what's captured here. Now, the combination of the two, when we click here in the source and medium, that's going to be the default primary dimension when you come to this report, but we can easily change this up here to focus on sources or mediums. So first, let's go ahead and hide this left nav again so we have a bit more room. And as we scan across the columns here, we can see how each of those sources and medium combos in a given row are performing, of course, beyond just the users. We want to see into engagement and transactions as well. All right, first let's look at that dimension that we said was similar to the channels report we were just viewing by clicking on the medium link here. And that's going to change our primary dimension to be just those broad buckets. Now, if we go and sort by sessions here, what we're going to see is that organic traffic definitely dominates our traffic. The top three, organic, referrals, and none, which actually really just means direct traffic to the site, they make up almost all the traffic. You look at these and add these. Here, it's almost all the traffic. The rest is a very small percentage. And of course, if we look over here on the revenue side, it's the same story. All the money is coming from these top three. So again, this is why I say it's the first one I go to when I see a client. So I can look at this report and almost instantly tell what's going on in terms of how you generate traffic and money to the site. Okay, I'm going to switch back actually to the source medium here and get a bit more granularity. I want to see which of these sites are actually referring this traffic here. Now I could just click into the referrals and go that way, but I can scan through here and get an idea. One thing that catches my eye here, if I come down to the bottom, there's not very many sessions coming here, but there is a pretty good conversion rate on this, and it's sending a decent amount of revenue here, even though there's not a ton of traffic coming through there. Bounce rate's also extremely low at around 14%. Speaking of bounce rate, I see a couple more up here, 12% and 13%. And again, if we look over here, those are contributing quite a bit of revenue as well, even though the number of sessions is significantly lower. Here, the top one, we have by far the highest number of sessions, but it's not the highest contributor to revenue. Let's see if we can find any other jewels by doing a weighted sort on this e-commerce conversion rate. So again, this is dominated by referrals here. We have folks who come directly to the site. And of course, if someone comes directly to your site, they already know what they want. The chances that they're going to convert are pretty high. But there's also some down here that are actually contributing even more revenue. So we definitely want to look into some of these referrals and understand what's going on with the sites that are sending us this much traffic that's contributing this much revenue. So let's take a minute to talk about data quality. We're starting to get into reports where we aren't just tracking sessions and things are very black and white and easily tracked tracking code. We're adding extra data and context to describe these visits. So we provide that context, such as whether or not they're in email or organic searches. But to trust this data, we have to be confident that it is being classified here correctly. Some of these Google can pick up automatically. But we'll talk about a video a bit later on about campaign tagging that's going to give us some more information where we're going to put this in here. And that's how we can ensure Google Analytics is able to populate these reports correctly. And it's aware of your marketing activities, including how to identify all these sources of medium. Now, in general, Sources Medium Report here is going to provide some of the most fundamental information a web analytics package can offer. In this simple, easy to adjust report, we know which sources, mediums, campaigns are performing on your site, and maybe just as importantly, which ones aren't. When we left the last video, we noticed that the referrals to our sites had some pretty impressive traffic quality metrics. We want to dig in a little bit further. For that, there's actually an entire report devoted just to referrals, which we'll open here and get under the acquisition section called referrals. We'll go ahead and close the navigation so we can see the whole thing. Now recall that referring sites is simply a fancy way to describe sites that link to yours. In other words, sites that refer traffic to your site. Google Analytics has the ability to detect that incoming visit from a link and record which page sent the link as the referring site. From then on, anything that's done during this visit, a goal, transaction will be credited or attributed back to that referring source. Now we see here a data table that lists all the sites that referred traffic to us via a link. YouTube here is a dominant source. You can see from this small 37% in parentheses that this single referral source is almost 40% of all of our referrals. But you probably know by now, I'm immediately going to look over and look at how it does with respect to our goals or our e-commerce conversions, and we're seeing a bit of mixed signals. You see that YouTube contributes almost 40% of the total traffic volume, but only 0.28% of the revenue for the merchandise store within this month, and the e-commerce conversion rate is only 0.06%. So although more users came to the site from YouTube, not too many of those converted or actually purchased something. So let's go ahead and sort this table by revenue. And we see that YouTube is only really number 6 on this and quite a ways down from our top ones here. Let's actually take a quick look at e-commerce conversion rate as well. It's always an interesting one. And then remember, what we want to do is a weighted sort most of the time here that will highlight the ones that are particularly interesting in both volume, particularly since this is a rate. We can see the ones that have enough volume to matter. Now, because this data is only from within a month, you're still going to see a few stragglers. We can see a few sources with a greater number of users and a pretty solid conversion rate, however, but YouTube isn't even on the page for this metric. Now, it's always a good time to find hidden gems within this referral sources, particularly when I work with clients who see unexpected sources pop up. The first question they have is, I wonder where are they sending this traffic to on my site? We can easily answer that with a secondary dimension. So again, we're going to go back to sorting by users. Get our major traffic sources here. And we're going to add a secondary dimension of landing page. So this is going to be where are they actually landing when they come to my site. So what we get here is a combination of these two dimensions. So here you can see a source over on the first column. So it's coming from YouTube, it's coming from Google, and this is where it's landing on our site. What is the page that they're coming to? Sometimes you'll see repeated sources, analytics.google.com, if they are linking to two different places. There's a link to our homepage on analytics.google.com, and there is also apparently a link here as well. Now, one of the things you can do if you want to investigate this a little closer is actually click on this link. So if we want to see where on sites.google.com is it sending, and then it will give us the referral path. The referral path is the page on the site that's sending the traffic. So it's coming from this page to our site. This isn't the page on our site. Now, if we want to put it all together and say, okay, it's coming from this page to the next page, you probably guessed it. We'll go up here and add a landing page as our secondary source, and we can see the referral path from the site that's sending the traffic, and then the landing page to where it's coming from. So we know it's coming from this page to this page. In either case, if you want to go check out one of these pages, you can click this little box here, and it will pop open a browser with a link to that page. For example, if I click this one, pops open the home page of our merchandise store. So as you can see here, there is a ton of info we can uncover about who is linking to us, where they're linking from, where they're linking to. I encourage you to spend some time digging in these with your own reports. With this referral reports, you can determine not only who's sending that traffic, but just as importantly, which sources send quality traffic that converts on your goals. Always something to keep in mind. With the referral reports, we were able to see other sites that sent users to our store through a referring link. We were able to get that because websites and web browsers provide that info, and we can automatically capture those things in our analytics. But if I want to supply some extra info about the click, perhaps if this click is part of a paid campaign or an email or social media post, we have a way that we can tell Google Analytics to track that extra info. We call this manual tagging. Look at one example here. Let's say that you have a marketing campaign happening with just one source. So in this case, our source is Twitter. How do we differentiate the traffic coming from one tweet on sale items versus another tweet on buy one, get one free t-shirts? Since the source is Twitter, and of course the medium is social, there's really no way to separate these two lines of traffic with just these two pieces of information, and we don't want to start stuffing these two with extra info. We're going to use another field. This is where the campaign reports come in. And this is one of the most useful and important concepts on Google Analytics. When you add campaigns to the mix, you could track different marketing initiatives by source, medium, and a campaign name instead of just inferring which traffic belonged to which ad within a source you pushed, say, during a certain period of time. So let's think back to this Twitter example. So by tagging the two Twitter posts here as different campaigns, we can easily differentiate between the two traffic groups both coming in from that source because we've tagged the top one of a campaign of flash sale and we've tagged the bottom one with the buy one, get one t-shirt. So let's look at how exactly we would do that. We're going to track these campaigns using what's called UTM parameters. These are going to be a regular URL, extra information, these UTM parameters into that URL. Google has a special tool to help us do this. So the first thing we're going to put in here is our website. So let's go ahead and put that in. Let's say this is going to be cardinalpath.com. You can also put in your full page. So if you want this to be a specific page, you can put that in here as well. Then we put the campaign source. So in this case, we said the source was Twitter. And then the medium we said was social. And the campaign name we said was flash sale, the first one. Now here, if you have paid keywords, you can add those in as well. And if you even want to differentiate between different ads, so maybe flash sale with the red shirt was one of them, and blue shirt or something would be another. And if you look down here, it's going to create this URL. And stuffed inside of this, we have first our just standard page, and then stuffed inside here, we have a UTM source was Twitter, we have UTM medium of social, campaign was a flash sale, and the content was the red shirt. And these things aren't going to matter at all to your website and how it loads, but Google is going to understand these and it's going to interpret them into your Google Analytics. And anything that I do on this page or this session is going to be automatically categorized by this source, medium, campaign, and content. So what you're going to do as a marketer is you're going to take this entire URL, and this is now going to be the URL that you send your marketing. Put out a tweet, you put this one. If someone clicks on this link, it's going to be automatically tracked into Google Analytics. So let's take a look at how that would work. If we come back to here to Google Analytics, we come under the campaigns. And what we're going to see here is that campaign info. So for example, I would see something here called flash sale. And we would be able to see not only how many users came in through that flash sale, what their behavior was, conversions, revenue, all of the metrics that we've normally looked for would now be bucketed under folks who came in under that campaign. And if we wanted to see what the campaign was differentiated by, we also can come up here to things like ad content. And we could look at that, for example, as a secondary dimension. And then we would see here flash sale as our campaign, and then we would see red shirt as our content, because remember, that's what we set here was campaign was flash sale and the content was red shirt. Okay. So we've covered an important concept here. I can't stress enough the importance of campaign tagging. By tagging these campaigns consistently, every time you put out a tweet, every link that you put in an email, you'll make it very easy to come back and track and analyze those sources, and you'll understand which of those things are being clicked on, which ones are working, and which ones aren't. Ultimately, publishing a website is about publishing content, and understanding how that content is used and consumed is a principal goal of any analytics package. The behavior reports focus on the content within the pages of your site and how your users engage with it. Again, you can access the behavior section here on the left navigation bar. Under the behavior site here, it's just under the acquisition reports we were looking at. And let's go ahead and take a look at the overview here. Here, like the other overviews we've seen, you can get a condensed report made up of most of the important dimensions and metrics within this section. There's the familiar date over time graph, along with a bar of metrics that might be a little bit new to you here. Page views is the total number of times the page was viewed. This specific number being the accrual of all the views of all the pages within the Google Merchandise Store that we're seeing here in the month of June. Unique page views is different as many times as they want, which would be the total number of page views. However, here for unique page views, it's the number of sessions during which that page was viewed at least once. So even if you view that one multiple times in a session, it's only going to be counted once. So if you reload a certain page, we're really trying to understand how many sessions saw this page. Average time on page is just how it sounds. It's the average amount of time a user spends on a specific page. The bounce rate is the percent of users who enter and exit the website on a landing page without interacting with it at all. In other words, the entire visit only had one page. It was a page they came in on, and that was it. That's all they did. And the percent exit is the number of times a user exits that page over the total number of views of that page it accumulates. It represents how many users are leaving the site from that page versus continuing on their session to other pages. Now remember, if you're ever unsure what a metric means or how it's calculated, you simply hover over the name here, and it's going to provide you a quick definition of what that is and how it's calculated. Now, the rest of the overview here is split up by important dimensions under site content, site search, and events. We're going to be going over these in more detail as these really kind of make up the meat of the behavior section. Below the overview here is the behavior flow. This report is interesting. It visualizes the path that users take from one page on your site to the next or one content group. It can also display the events that the user acted upon. It can be useful in that it helps you visually understand how your user engaging with your site, where they're dropping off, where they go next, which pages can be further optimized to improve performance. And this is going to be most useful if you create content groups. If we come up here and take a look at how we're going to do this, these first ones are here by content groups, but that's a bit more of an advanced topic. You can still select the pages down here, and you can understand how folks are flowing from one page to the other, even if you don't have content group. You come up here, select a page to start with, and it will show you, starting with that page, what the interactions were as people went through your site. Okay, again, from here we can see these subcategories where engagement is mainly categorized under site content, site speed, site search, and events that you're going to configure. We're going to take a closer look at those in more detail in this chapter. Site content is going to cover the pages within your site, including the landing and the exit pages, and how your audience is interacting with them. The site speed reports help describe which pages could be improved to decrease your load time. And Google Analytics is even going to offer some suggestions on just how to do that. Site search is useful if your website has an internal search function that your users can use. These reports give some insight on how that search is performing. And the events section is all about the events that you can configure and track. And again, we're going to go more in depth than that in this chapter. There's also a publisher section down here, which is a bit more specialized. So we're not going to go into that in this particular course. But if you do connect your Google Analytics with AdSense, Ad Exchange, or DoubleClick for publishers, this may be an interesting section to look into. Overall, this behavior section really helps answer the essential question of how are your users engaging with your site. Without understanding how your audience is interacting with the content of your site, you really won't be able to meet your business objectives or get your users to convert. These behavior content analytics are going to do just that in helping you figure out ways to improve your pages and the overall online experience.